A worried Martin calls his father Paul at the textile factory one night. When he mentions his mother being ill, his father assures him of getting home soon. Meanwhile, Paul's assistant, Esther, prepares to wrap up for the night when she notices the silhouette of a woman upon turning the lights off. Strangely, the silhouette disappears when she flicks them back on. She immediately informs Paul about it and asks him to be careful before getting on her way. Leaving himself a while later, Paul also comes across the silhouette. Getting closer to him, the shadow manages to injure him as he tries to escape. Running back to his office and locking himself in, Paul arms himself with a bat before carefully observing the place just as the lights go out. More alert now, he notices the door to his office being unlocked. However, this is all the warning he gets before he loses his life. Elsewhere, Martin's stepsister Rebecca kicks her boyfriend Brett out of her apartment with the promise of meeting him the next night. Unable to sleep, meanwhile, Martin pads through the house until he sees his mother, Sophie, speaking to something in the dark. Kindly sending him back to bed, Sophie bids her son good night. However, he sees a strange hand in the shadows with her, which causes him to rush to his bedroom and lock himself in. His fear elevates when his doorknob aggressively rattles before his bedside lamp is turned out. Fear having kept him up the whole night, Martin is unable to stay awake at school. When this happens repeatedly through the following week, the school decides to call Sophie. However, when calls to his mother go unanswered, the school eventually contacts Rebecca. Surprised to see a CPS agent at the school when she gets there, Rebecca mentions that Sophie has been on medication. Concerned about the situation, she then takes Martin home to Sophie. Upon hearing that their mother has been speaking to someone named Diana, Rebecca is taken aback. Recognizing the name, she tells Martin that she has been through this earlier when her father had taken off and left her behind with Sophie, having suffered severely bad dreams about Diana. Rebecca urges Martin to understand that Diana isn't real. Speaking to Sophie and realizing that she hasn't been seeing her therapist for a while, Rebecca figures out that she hasn't been taking her medication either. Meanwhile, Martin hastily packs a bag before noticing that the door to his father's office is open. While he tries to peek in, a shadow appears and the door is shut. Downstairs, Rebecca decides to take Martin to her house for a few days in an attempt to let Sophie pull herself together after losing Paul. Getting Martin settled at her place, Rebecca gets into an argument with Brett regarding her intentions of bringing her stepbrother home instead of speaking to the CPS agent assigned to him. Unwilling to fight, she sends him away. Later that night, Rebecca is awoken by a scratching sound. Initially assuming that it is Martin, she quickly realizes otherwise when the silhouette is visible only when the lights are out. She narrowly escapes the shadow's attack when she manages to flick the lights back on just in time. Thoroughly shaken by the encounter, she then discovers Martin peacefully sleeping in the bathtub. The next morning, the CPS agent Emma comes looking for Martin and reprimands Rebecca for her decision to keep him away from Sophie. Explaining that Martin's custody is Sophie's right as his legal guardian, Emma takes him back. After they leave, Sophie shockingly discovers the name Diana scratched onto her floor along with a stick figure. She is then immediately reminded of her childhood when she had seen a similar drawing. Realizing that Diana is real and can cause serious problems, Rebecca rushes back home with Brett. In Paul's office, she finds a photograph of a young Sophie with a girl named Diana. Curious, she then finds medical records that reveal Sophie had been admitted to an institution. As it turns out, Diana had been there as well for a rare skin disorder, implying that she was extremely sensitive to light. Having befriended Sophie, Diana was known to be a generally violent patient who would attack other patients when they got better. However, she had met a cruel end herself while undergoing an experimental light treatment which burnt her alive. In Martin's room later, Rebecca finds her drawing that Diana had defaced years ago. Just then, the door is slammed shut, and Rebecca hears Diana warning her to stay away. Diana then strangles Rebecca, who is saved by Brett's timely arrival. Along with the medical records then, Rebecca hurries out of the house with Brett. A while later, Sophie and Martin return home from shopping and she promises him a movie night later. While she seemed to have been getting better, Sophie does the unexpected that night when she turns the lights off and forcefully tells Martin about her friend Diana. She tells him that she felt like she abandoned her and that she was happy when Diana finally found her again. However, Martin remains scared and unwilling to meet Diana as per his mother's wish. Turning on the lights, he then manages to escape the house to eventually find his way back to Rebecca's place. Choosing to trust Martin, Rebecca decides to share the information she learned about Diana with him. She says that Paul's extensive research into the topic has revealed that Diana had apparently been found locked in a basement when she was 13 years old when her father had taken his own life after being influenced by her. Because of her ability to get into people's heads, Diana had quickly been turned evil. Rebecca believes that Diana got to Sophie at the institution but isn't really her friend because she only resurfaces when Sophie isn't doing well. Realizing that Sophie is Diana's only connection, Rebecca mentions that if Sophie could get better and somehow find a way to be mentally strong, there is a possibility of severing that connection. However, Martin realizes that Diana will not let it happen easily since Paul was trying to do exactly that before losing his life. Hearing scratching noises just then, Rebecca switches on her closet's light before looking for Diana there. Behind her, Martin is suddenly dragged under the bed and Rebecca strongly pulls him back to safety. Since they aren't safe from Diana's attacks even while away from Sophie's house, Rebecca, Martin and Brett make their way back there to speak to her. Showing Sophie the photograph with Diana, Rebecca urges her mother to accept that her life ended at the institution. Refusing to understand, Sophie concludes that Rebecca is trying to take Martin away from her instead. Taking it further, she even accuses Rebecca of having abandoned her and reiterates her choice of keeping her friend close so that she doesn't feel abandoned. Irritated at her daughter, Sophie eventually retires to her room for the night. Rebecca then asks Martin to spend the night at her place and promises to call Emma in the morning. However, unwilling to leave their mother on her own, Martin convinces his sister to stay there and tackle Diana. To ensure that they aren't caught in the house without lights, Rebecca tapes off the switches so they cannot be turned off while Brett places the bulbs back in the lamps and Martin finds candles. Settling in his brightly lit room later, Martin requests Rebecca to join him. Promising to come back once she tells Brett, Rebecca turns away just in time to see Diana's shadow in Paul's dark office. Finding its door locked, she heads downstairs to speak to Brett. Telling him about keeping Martin company for the night, she thanks him for being considerate enough to be with her through everything. Back upstairs, she decides to check on Sophie. To her surprise, Sophie requests for a fresh start the next day before giving her a much-needed hug. Just as Rebecca notices Sophie being pulled back into the room, she realizes that her mother managed to slip a note to her asking for her help. Determined, she tries to find Sophie's medication but isn't able to. Joining Martin then, she assures him of somehow figuring out a way to help their mother. However, it seems to be as difficult as Martin had predicted earlier, because their plan to keep the house completely lit fails soon later when Diana cuts the power off. While Rebecca heads down to look for Brett, he is outside when he realizes that Diana possibly took out the power of the entire neighborhood. In the basement, Rebecca desperately checks the mains just as Martin wakes up to the horror of the lights being out. Grabbing a candle, he calls out for Rebecca while getting out of his room. Just as he realizes that the torch he had hidden earlier is missing, he notices Diana in the shadows behind him. She latches onto him and drags him but lets him go when he directs the light of the candle towards her. Once he joins Rebecca in the basement, they realize too late that they are trapped just as Diana shuts the door on them. Brett then gets back in and hears Rebecca's cries for help. While he tries to break open the door's lock, he is ambushed by Diana. Initially thwarting her by shining his phone's bright screen towards her, he is eventually attacked again the moment he locks the screen. Managing to run outside, he then flashes his car's headlights to get rid of Diana. While he quickly drives away, Martin and Rebecca hear him leave just as her torch threatens to fizzle out. Deciding to find more light, they descend the stairs to look around the basement. Meanwhile, Sophie wakes up to a dark house. Spotting Diana, she warns her not to hurt her children. Having already realized that Diana cannot survive without her, a determined Sophie grabs her medication. However, before she can take any of the pills, Diana forces them out of her hands before shoving Sophie and knocking her out. In the basement, meanwhile, Rebecca uses a blacklight to look around the space before eventually coming across several messages Diana has been writing on the walls over the years. In the corner there, she then finds Diana herself. While being able to see her clearly because of the blacklight, Rebecca realizes that it isn't powerful enough to harm her or to get her to disappear. Martin shines their torch on her just then to save Rebecca, who quickly plans to use the blacklight to their advantage so they can at least see Diana before shooting the torch at her. Meanwhile, Brett gets back to the house with the police and tells them about Rebecca and Martin trapped in the basement. Entering the house cautiously, they head to the basement's door and burst open the lock, thereby freeing Rebecca and Martin. Upstairs, meanwhile, Sophie gains consciousness and breaks open the lock on her bedroom door. Amidst the shadows downstairs, Diana attacks and gets rid of one of the cops while the other urgently calls for backup before investigating the matter herself. Rebecca urges Martin to leave the house, but he insists on not leaving Sophie behind. Noticing movement, they then see that Diana has gotten rid of the second cop as well. When Brett gets to the house, Rebecca asks him to get Martin out while she promises to get Sophie to safety. On her way upstairs to Sophie's room, Diana informs Rebecca that she led her father to his end simply because he tried to help Sophie recover, just like Paul. She then catches hold of Rebecca and flings her back down, completely at Diana's mercy then. Rebecca is saved only when an armed Sophie firmly repeats her warning for Diana to stay away from her children. Rebecca tells her about Diana's involvement with her father's end just as Sophie shoots Diana. However, knowing that it wouldn't hurt her, Sophie pulls the gun on herself to save the lives of her kids. While Diana rushes to stop her, she immediately disappears when Sophie puts her kids before herself. As a heartbroken Rebecca grieves her loss, Brett comforts an equally shaken Martin. In an ambulance after their night of ordeal, Rebecca appreciates Brett coming back to rescue them. A flickering light startles them just then, even as Brett assures Rebecca and Martin of their safety. A transformed Rebecca then promises never to leave Martin, thereby becoming the responsible guardian her stepbrother deserves.